There is a strange, subtle feeling that something isn't right when you look closely at the official story of human history. We are used to being told that history is a straight line of constant progress, where every generation is technologically superior to the one before it. But if you look closely at the late 19th century, that line starts to break, revealing traces of a completely different reality. There is a persistent feeling that the official version of events is just a thin veil hiding the foundation of a lost, far more advanced civilization. The main question here isn't just about architectural styles, but about the timeline of our existence itself. When did the modern era really begin? Researchers are increasingly exploring the theory of a global reset, after which humanity suddenly found itself in a new world that had already been built by someone else. When you dig into the archives of the 19th and early 20th centuries, you see a striking contrast. City streets filled with simple horse-drawn carts, mud, and people living very primitive lives, standing right next to magnificent buildings that look far too perfect for their time. These structures possess such engineering complexity and grandeur that building them should have been impossible with the technology officially available back then. It feels as though we arrived in this world when the most important things had already been created. Powerful engineering solutions, perfectly planned cities, massive domes and colonnades. All of it looks as if it were built long before the people in those old photographs ever showed up. It seems these people simply moved into empty sets, adapted them for their own needs, but didn't create them from scratch. Furthermore, there is a strange cutoff point. A multitude of unique technologies, architectural styles, and engineering principles suddenly vanish right after the year 1900, as if someone turned off access to that knowledge. This anomaly is most obvious in the events historians call the triumph of industrial progress, the World's Fairs of the late 19th century. Official science claims that these incredibly beautiful and massive complexes were built solely for short-term events, only to be ruthlessly destroyed a few months later. We are asked to believe that colossal funds, comparable to the budgets of entire nations, were spent on erecting disposable architectural masterpieces. However, when you analyze the quality of these structures, their detail, and their scale, the story about temporary pavilions begins to fall apart. Who in their right mind would build an entire city of palaces filled with complex infrastructure only to turn it into ruins immediately after the fair closed? It sounds much more logical and frightening to suggest that these buildings were not built for the exhibitions at all. They were inherited. These events may have served merely as a cover to legalize and show off the achievements of a previous civilization, not ours, which disappeared for unknown reasons, leaving us only stone evidence of its greatness. These exhibitions become the key that unlocks the door to understanding the true history hidden from us. To grasp the sheer scale of this historical inconsistency, we only need to look at one specific example that still baffles independent researchers. This is the famous Chicago World's Fair of 1893, officially held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. Textbooks present this as a grand celebration, but the dry numbers and facts paint a picture that simply doesn't fit with the construction capabilities of the late 19th century. On an area exceeding 690 acres, a complex was unveiled that contemporaries reverently called the White City. This name was no accident. The architectural ensemble shone with impeccable whiteness and classical harmony, resembling a dream of an ideal ancient metropolis brought to life. This giant area didn't just host exhibition stands or temporary tents. It housed 14 monumental palace-like buildings. Any one of them, in size and grandeur, could have been the centerpiece of a European capital. Surrounding these colossi was a complex network of perfectly planned avenues, wide plazas adorned with hundreds of sculptures, and water canals reminiscent of Venice. And here is where the official history begins to contradict common sense and the laws of physics. We are told that this architectural masterpiece, comparable in complexity to a full city center, was erected in just 2 years. Moreover, it is claimed that construction took place in a virtually empty field on the swampy lands of Jackson Park, which alone would have required colossal efforts to drain and prepare the soil before laying the first stone. Compare these claimed speeds with modern construction realities. Today, with advanced computer design, heavy machinery, tower cranes, and streamlined logistics, building a single large stadium or shopping mall takes 3 to 5 years. Yet in Chicago, if we believe the historical records, in an era of horsepower and steam engines, without modern mechanization, an entire metropolis was created in just over 20 months. This isn't just about walls and roofs, but full infrastructure, laying utilities, creating artificial lakes, bridges, and high-level landscape design. The logistics of delivering millions of tons of building materials by horse-drawn transport in such a tight time frame looks not just like an organizational feat, but a mathematical impossibility. Every element of this complex, from the giant domes to the elegant colonnades, required precise calculations and the highest skill from thousands of workers. If we imagine that all this was truly built from scratch in the declared time, the density of work would have been such that the builders would have been tripping over each other. It would have had to be a 24-hour anthill, working without a single glitch, error, or supply delay, which seems like absolute utopia for that time. There is a strong feeling that we are being shown the result, but the true process of its appearance is hidden. It seems much more plausible that these deadlines were invented retroactively, to hide the fact that the White City was not built, but restored or excavated. We see finished, permanent structures, the scale of which is overwhelming. This doesn't look like a temporary fair thrown together in a hurry. It looks like a display of imperial power meant to last for centuries. However, the official version insists these were just decorations. And to justify the incredible speed of these palaces' appearance, historians offer an argument that, upon closer inspection, sounds less like an explanation and more like a mockery of anyone's common sense. They tell us the secret lies in the materials from which these majestic temples of science and art were allegedly molded. Official historiography asks us to accept on faith that all the splendor of the Chicago World's Fair was nothing more than a skillfully created illusion. They tell us that what we are looking at is not stone, granite, or marble, but merely wood, plaster, and hemp, a material called staff used for temporary sets. However, when you examine the specific objects in detail, this story begins to crack as it crashes into the visual reality captured in the archives. Take, for example, the structure the organizers modestly called the Agricultural Building. Based on the name, you might expect a functional pavilion, a hangar, or at best, a light structure with some thematic decor. But reality shows something completely different. We are presented with a colossal structure that looks more like the Roman Pantheon, the Vatican, or a royal palace than a place to display pumpkin farming and reapers. The facade is adorned with massive Corinthian columns, with perfect proportions indicating a deep understanding of ancient architectural laws. A giant dome rises from the roof, topped with a complex sculptural group, and dozens of statues line the perimeter, each a work of art in itself. It is hard to imagine that engineers and artists spent thousands of man-hours working out the tiniest details of capitals and cornices, knowing that all this magnificence was doomed to be demolished in 6 months. Usually, temporary structures are built on the principle of good enough, a frame, some cladding, and a rough paint job. Here we see excessive fanatical detailing, typical only of permanent construction meant to last for centuries. The criticism of the temporary materials theory grows stronger if you consider the physical properties of plaster and wood. Chicago, known as the Windy City, sits on the shores of Lake Michigan, where humidity and sharp temperature changes are common. Plaster is an extremely fragile material that does not last long in such conditions. Yet, in numerous photographs, the surfaces of the buildings look perfectly smooth and monolithic, with no signs of warping, cracking, or moisture damage. They reflect light exactly the way polished marble or high-quality stone does. If we assume this was indeed an imitation, the skill level of the plasterers and decorators must have bordered on wizardry. To create an illusion indistinguishable from hewn stone out of hemp and cement on such a colossal scale is a task arguably more difficult and expensive than building with real stone. Furthermore, the scale of the load-bearing structures raises legitimate questions. Huge spans, heavy domes, and arches require a serious engineering foundation. A wooden frame capable of supporting such weight and maintaining its geometry under wind loads would have to be incredibly complex and massive. The amount of lumber required for such a frame would be astronomical. Isn't it simpler to assume that these buildings looked like stone palaces because they were stone palaces? Their monumentality, style, and execution suggest they are the legacy of a high culture for whom such aesthetics were the norm, not a carnival costume. The very concept of using classical, imperial architecture for a temporary fair seems illogical. The antique style symbolizes eternity, stability, and a connection to the divine. It is the language of power and permanence. Building for one summer in such a style is an oxymoron. Most likely, the fair organizers simply utilized an existing, perhaps restored ancient complex, giving it new names and functions. The building labeled as an agricultural pavilion could easily have been a temple or an administrative center of an ancient city. However, if the exterior of the buildings can still be explained away, however unconvincingly, by the genius of decorators, the contents of these pavilions and the environment around them baffle even the most skeptical researchers. The architecture is just the outer shell, hiding something behind the facades that was completely out of sync with the official picture of the late 19th century. What was inside and around these buildings frightens historians even more, because these technologies were decades, if not centuries, ahead of their time. What happened on the grounds of the Chicago World's Fair after sunset completely destroys the accepted picture of the late 19th century. At a time when most of the planet plunged into darkness at night, broken only by the dim light of candles, kerosene lamps, or rare gas streetlights, the White City erupted with millions of electric lights, turning into a shining beacon of a futuristic tomorrow. This wasn't a timid experiment with a few incandescent bulbs. It was total, blinding illumination, the power of which could rival the lighting of a modern metropolis. Huge searchlights cut through the night sky. Buildings were highlighted by complex contour lighting systems, and electric fountains played with all the colors of the rainbow. Behind this spectacle stood the figure of the genius Nikola Tesla. It was here in Chicago that the decisive battle in the famous War of the Currents between Edison and Tesla took place. The alternating current system developed by Tesla powered the entire exhibition. But let's think about the technical side of things. To power such a giant complex, you didn't just need a couple of generators. You needed a full-scale, powerful power plant and an extensive network of substations. Kilometers of underground cables, a complex system of load distribution, and fuses were required. We are asked to believe that this colossal energy infrastructure, unparalleled in the world at the time, was designed, manufactured, and installed in record time solely to run for 6 months and then be dismantled. The technological miracles of the fair weren't limited to just light. Visitors encountered mechanisms that seemed like aliens from the future. Take, for instance, the famous moving sidewalk, an electric conveyor belt for pedestrians that circled part of the complex. This solution, which even today isn't found in every major airport, worked flawlessly back then, transporting thousands of people. Or look at the fair's main engineering marvel, George Ferris's giant observation wheel. This structure was intended to be America's answer to the Eiffel Tower. But while the Parisian Tower is static, the Ferris wheel was a dynamic machine of monstrous proportions. It was 80 meters high, and each of its 36 cars was the size of a bus or a small studio apartment, holding up to 60 people. The axle of this wheel was the largest single piece of forged steel ever created in history at that time. Installing such a structure required jewel-like precision and cranes with incredible lifting capacity. The entire mechanism rotated with perfect smoothness, driven by powerful steam engines and a complex gear system. Looking at the blueprints and surviving descriptions of this monster, it is impossible to shake the thought that this was a permanent structure, built to last for decades. The engineering safety margin, the quality of the metal, the complexity of the nodes, all of this contradicts the idea of a temporary amusement ride. Who cast the world's largest steel axle for a 6-month attraction? Additionally, the pavilions displayed electrical devices and units whose purpose is still debated today. There were not only household appliances, but industrial units resembling modern free energy generators or atmospheric electricity devices. The level of craftsmanship of these machines, their design and functionality speak of a mature, refined technology, not the first tentative steps of industrialization. All of this looked less like an exhibition of achievements humanity had been working toward for centuries, and more like a demonstration of a ready-made technological ecosystem that had suddenly become available. Infrastructure of this complexity does not appear out of nowhere. It requires decades of scientific development, a manufacturing base, and logistics. In Chicago, it appeared as if by magic, fully ready, debugged, and working. This sharp technological leap, concentrated in one place, looks alien against the backdrop of the rest of America at that time. Looking at this foundation, at these kilometers of wires and tons of steel, the most terrifying and uncomfortable question arises. What if all this infrastructure wasn't built specifically for the exhibition? What if the exhibition was just a convenient excuse, a screen, allowing them to temporarily use and show the public what was already there? This brings us to the turning point of our investigation, where scattered facts come together into a single picture that is frightening in its logic. If we discard the official version of high-speed construction using plaster and hemp, which falls apart at the first encounter with engineering reality, only one explanation remains that can resolve all contradictions. This is the hypothesis that the White City in Chicago, like many other similar complexes at other World's Fairs, was not built in the late 19th century at all. It was found. According to this theory, the territory of Jackson Park concealed the ruins of an ancient, majestic metropolis, belonging to that same vanished global civilization. What historians call construction was actually a massive archaeological operation involving excavation, cleaning buildings from layers of soil, restoring facades, and re-establishing utilities. The group of architects and engineers presented to us as the genius authors of the project likely served as managers of restoration works. Their task was to adapt the ancient structures for the needs of the exhibition, make them look presentable, and, most importantly, invent new names and purposes for them that contemporaries could understand. This version explains the phenomenal durability of the buildings. No one spends budgets comparable to a small nation's treasury on a temporary show. But if the city was already standing, the costs for cosmetic repairs and organizing the event become entirely justified. This also explains the perfect layout and the complex hydraulic system of canals and ponds that functioned as a single organism. Creating such a drainage and water logistics system in a swamp in 2 years is impossible. But if it was part of the original urban infrastructure that was simply unclogged and restarted, everything falls into place. Particular attention should be paid to the buildings called the Machinery Hall and the Electricity Building. Under the alternative hypothesis, these structures were never just exhibition halls. Their architecture, internal volume, reinforced foundations, and specific layout indicate that they were originally industrial facilities, real power plants or factory floors of that ancient era. In old documents and catalogs, some of them are explicitly referred to as powerhouses. It is likely that the organizers found surviving equipment or the places where it was installed and used these buildings for their direct original purpose, passing off ancient technologies as the latest inventions of Tesla and Edison. The widespread use of white paint, which gave the complex its name, also becomes understandable. If you are restoring a group of disparate buildings damaged by time and cataclysms, built from different stones or showing signs of destruction, the easiest way to hide defects and give the ensemble a unified look is to cover everything with a thick layer of white plaster or paint. Thus, an ancient, perhaps thousand-year-old city turned into a shining novelty, the White City of 1893. This theory also answers the question of the strange dissonance between the architecture and the people. The people of the 19th century, with their horses and steam boilers, looks like children who had snuck into their father's office. They used a space that was not created by them and not for them. Giant doorways designed for giants, soaring ceilings, the acoustics of the halls. All of this speaks of different standards of living and a different scale of the creators. We simply occupied an empty place, claimed others' achievements as our own, and proudly called it progress. However, if we accept this hypothesis as truth, the next, even more disturbing question inevitably arises. If these majestic cities were indeed a legacy of the past, miraculously surviving through the centuries, why don't we see them today? Why didn't they become the centers of our culture, museums, or administrative capitals? The answer to this question reveals perhaps the greatest crime against our collective memory, committed coldly and intentionally. The fate of the White City, like many other similar exhibition complexes around the world, was sealed from the start. And this finale became one of the most tragic and mysterious episodes in the history of architecture. The official chronicle states that shortly after the exhibition closed, in July 1894, a massive fire destroyed most of the structures. The fire, which allegedly started accidentally, devoured colonnades, domes, and statues with incredible fury, turning into ash what had caused millions to marvel just yesterday. However, the circumstances of this tragedy raise a lot of suspicion. The fire started too conveniently and spread too methodically, as if following an order to clear the area. It resembled not a natural disaster, but the destruction of evidence at a crime scene. But even fire couldn't do all the work. The buildings that survived the flames, or were only partially damaged, were marked for demolition. And here begins the most interesting part, completely refuting the myth of cardboard decorations. If these palaces were truly built of wood, plaster, and hemp, dismantling them would have taken a matter of weeks and required little effort. A couple of crews with crowbars and saws would have sufficed. However, historical reports on the demolition testify to the opposite. Contractors faced incredible difficulties. They had to use dynamite, heavy machinery, and enormous human resources to destroy what were called temporary pavilions. The structures resisted destruction with the stubbornness of permanent fortresses. Inside the plaster columns, powerful metal rods and stone masonry were found. Walls that were supposed to be thin partitions turned out to be multi-layered brick or concrete monoliths. The demolition of the exhibition turned into a long, expensive, and labor-intensive operation. Why use so much dynamite to destroy plywood? The answer is obvious. Because it wasn't plywood. These were full-fledged, eternal buildings that were destroyed intentionally and with great difficulty. This scheme, build, show, destroy, was repeated with frightening regularity, not just in Chicago. St. Louis, San Francisco, Buffalo, Paris, the script was the same everywhere. Incredible antique cities were erected or opened, Lavish events were held, and then everything was ruthlessly demolished under the pretext of dilapidation or the end of land leases. It looks like a global program to erase historical memory. The organizers of these shows seem to be telling humanity, look at this greatness, remember it, because you will never see it again. Now your lot is simple brick boxes and concrete blocks. The destruction of these complexes had a deep ideological meaning. If these cities had remained standing, they would have become silent witnesses that the official version of history is false. People living among such architecture would inevitably start asking questions about their ancestors, about the technologies of the past, about why modern construction cannot repeat such elegance and quality. Leaving these buildings meant admitting that civilization used to be more advanced, unified, and harmonious. This would have destroyed the imposed concept of linear progress, where we are the pinnacle of evolution and our ancestors were primitive beings. Therefore, beauty had to die. It was sacrificed to create a new picture of the world, convenient for managing the masses. The ruins of the White City were quickly cleared, the debris hauled away, and the land regraded to erase even the memory of where exactly these colossi stood. We were left with only black and white photos and fairy tales about plaster mock-ups. It seemed the cleanup operation went perfectly, and the truth was buried forever under a layer of ash and construction waste. However, despite the total nature of the destruction, the executors of this plan made a mistake. They couldn't destroy absolutely everything. In different corners of the world, and even in Chicago itself, isolated buildings survived, having avoided the fate of their brethren for some reason. These surviving stone witnesses stand to this day, silently refuting every word in the history textbooks. And it is these fragments, miraculously surviving the fire of oblivion, that give us a unique opportunity to touch the reality of the world that existed before the global reset. And yet, despite the total cleanup and the manic desire to erase traces of the past, the perpetrators of this grand historical forgery failed to destroy everything without a trace. Cracks remain in this wall of lies, through which the light of truth shines. Some structures condemned to demolition survived thanks to incredible coincidences and the desperate resistance of local residents, historians, and activists who intuitively felt the value of these objects. One of the most striking examples is the former Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago, known today as the Museum of Science and Industry. This building stands to this day, a monumental refutation of the official legend about temporary materials. If it had been built of wood and plaster, as historians claim, it would have turned to dust after a few winters under the harsh winds from Lake Michigan. Yet it stands, amazing us with its power, the massiveness of its walls, and the perfection of its forms. Its existence proves that the other 13 palaces of the White City, destroyed by fire and dynamite, were just as permanent and eternal. It is a surviving witness whose testimony in the court of history could overturn the entire case. But the most important discovery comes not when we look at a single building, but when we start thinking globally. Cast your mind's eye over a map of the world. Similar structures, executed in the so-called antique or neoclassical style, are scattered across all continents. We see identical colonnades, domes, porticos, and arches in St. Petersburg, Sevastopol, Rome, Athens, Washington, Paris, as well as in India, Australia, and South Africa. Official science fragments this phenomenon into dozens of different styles and eras: Classicism, Baroque, Empire, Renaissance, Colonial style. We are taught that the ancient Greeks and Romans built this way thousands of years ago, and then, centuries later, architects from different countries suddenly decided to imitate them en masse. However, the alternative view offers a much more logical and fascinating explanation. What we are used to calling antiquity is not the property of a specific time or people living on a peninsula in the Mediterranean Sea. It is a single, global architectural code. It is the construction standard of that same unified world civilization that existed before known history. These buildings do not imitate Rome, they are part of that world which was ubiquitous. These are traces of a global empire or union that possessed standardized technologies, a unified aesthetic, and the ability to erect masterpieces anywhere on the planet, from Siberia to America. If the buildings of the World's Fairs hadn't been destroyed, if these white cities had remained standing in Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco, we would have grown up in a completely different reality. Walking the streets of these cities, we would see an unbreakable connection with the architecture of Europe and Asia. The illusion of a divided world would collapse. We would realize that borders, national differences, and cultural barriers are recent inventions, artificially created on the ruins of something common and great. We would stop perceiving history as an endless war of all against all, and would see that humanity was once a single whole, living in harmony with technology and beauty. That is exactly why they had to be destroyed. To divide us, to make us forget our kinship, to convince us that we always lived in primitive shacks, and only now, thanks to industrialization, have begun to climb out of the mud. The destruction of architecture is the destruction of memory. Stone speaks the truth, unlike paper, which can be rewritten countless times. But now, possessing this knowledge, you will no longer be able to look at cities with the same eyes. Passing by an old building with columns, a theater, a train station, or a museum allegedly built in the 19th century, stop. Look closely at its details. Ask yourself, could people with chisels and hammers arriving on carts really have built this? Or is this another fragment of that great forgotten era that they didn't have time or failed to hide? The truth isn't somewhere far away. It is hidden right before our eyes, encoded in stone, waiting for us to finally wake up and read it. The history we are taught is just a version. The true chronicle of the planet stands on the streets of our cities, silent but majestic, keeping the secret of the unified world that was stolen from us.